Ukraine's counteroffensive against Russian occupiers is gradually taking shape. Ukraine's military says it's retaken a number of villages from Russian forces in the southeast of the country. The gains reported over 2 days are the first by Ukraine in months. The villages are said to have been recaptured in a cluster of settlements in Donetsk, a region that's partially occupied by Russia. Now, Ukrainian troops released this video, which they say shows them posing with their flag in one of the captured villages. Russia's military, however, says it has repelled Ukrainian attempts to advance in the area. Well, in that video released by the Ukrainian military, soldiers spoke about the advance. Here's one called Doc describing what happened.
The operation started at around 5 in the morning. We deployed from our armoured vehicles and started to charge. The enemy showed resistance, tried to pin us down with artillery, but we managed to break through that and take the initiative. And slowly, house by house, we took the village. We destroyed the enemy's special battle equipment. 4 Rashists were taken as POWs.
Stephen Wertheim is a senior fellow in the American Statecraft Program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Like many of us, he's been watching the war in Ukraine unfold. But for some time, he's also been thinking about the future and whether a stable peace can be achieved. Welcome to DW. Let's start with the West's current stance towards this war, backing for Ukraine come what may. Do you see this as a sensible position?
I think it makes sense given this stage of the war, but it will soon not make a whole lot of sense, and there will be a need to move beyond the posture of as long as it takes, and finally answer that question that's begged by that phrase, as long as it takes to do what? I think there's a pretty wide awareness in Europe and the United States that the outcome of the current counteroffensive, which is finally underway, will be really important to trying to evaluate what can Ukraine realistically achieve through further conflict, and what might afford Ukraine enough security to return to the negotiating table, or at least attempt to go to the negotiating table and see if Moscow is also interested.
OK, lots to unpick from what you've just said in that one answer. You say that this attitude is OK for now. So what changes? At what point does the West say, all right, let's just rethink this?
Well, I think as the counteroffensive comes to a close later in this year, and I want to emphasize much later, it is the very early days. We can't draw any conclusions really about how the offensive will go from what we've seen so far. But toward the end of the year, in the autumn, then I think we'll have a sense of how Ukraine has fared. And in turn, that will put people in a position to ask, what would another year of fighting yield? And how solid is the coalition of Ukraine's partners in supporting Ukraine? Is time on Russia's side or on Ukraine's side? So I think these conversations are already happening to some degree. NATO will hold a summit in Vilnius next month, and that will also be an occasion to think about what Ukraine's post-war, post-conflict support might be.
And it's interesting, your use of words there, a post-war situation rather than peace, because any peace, if it comes, is likely to be an uneasy one for Ukrainians, I would have thought. Either they win and join NATO, and then they have to constantly worry about the Russian bear on their doorstep, or they lose and become absorbed into Russia's sphere of influence, and the West gradually becomes bored or distracted by other matters.
Not only do we not know when this war will end, more importantly, we don't know how, and it's not clear that there will be a clear ending. The conflict that took place, that began in 2014 in Donbass, became a quote-unquote frozen conflict, so it was not resolved. There wasn't a peace. But it was also regarded by many observers as something other than a very active war. So a kind of stalemated situation is one potential possibility for this conflict, although the scale of this conflict is much greater than the one that was confined to Donbass since 2014. So I think we might actually see, we're used to thinking of a binary between war and peace. We might see something that is somewhere in the middle, where we need to take a long-term view of what will provide security for Ukraine, and do so in the midst of a war that we all very much hope will come to a definitive end and a lasting end, but very well might not. For example, making multi-year commitments by Ukraine's partners to provide defense materials to Ukraine. This is something that could start sooner rather than later, and could actually have a positive effect on the conflict itself. It would show Russia that Western support will be ongoing, so that it can't just wait out Ukraine and wait out the West. It might also give Ukraine greater confidence that it doesn't need to adopt the most maximalist aims in this war, because it has a viable path for security in the longer term.
And just and in terms of that longer term security, can a Ukraine that is somewhere in the middle, as you put it, can that Ukraine join NATO?
Well, there's been increasing discussion of that possibility. It's something that Ukrainians want at this point, that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that he wants, although he's recognized that under NATO standards, it couldn't happen until after the current conflict. And again, there's been a conflict between Russia and Ukraine since 2014. I think, though, when we think about whether Ukraine should eventually join NATO, it's useful to think of a balance sheet of how would Ukraine's membership enhance deterrence versus the possibility that it might provide a provocation that would cause Russia to reinvade. So many people hope that they think NATO is the ultimate deterrent. I think that is subject to questioning. I fear that the NATO pledge in Ukraine's case would potentially have a credibility problem, because, in fact, when Ukraine has been attacked by Russia since 2014 and since 2022, every NATO country has demonstrated that it did not, in fact, wish to go to war with Russia directly to defend Ukraine, as Article 5 of NATO's charter would require. So that makes me concerned. How would Moscow actually perceive the credibility of the deterrent? On the other hand, you have the provocation, and Vladimir Putin has consistently said that Ukraine joining NATO is unacceptable and would be treated as a threat to Russian security. It was one of his several rationales for launching the full-scale invasion more than a year ago. And frankly, this is a concern that, whether we like it or not, and we don't like it, to speak for people in Washington, among many others, but it's been well recognized over decades that, as the current CIA director, Bill Burns, wrote when he was ambassador to Russia in 2008, that Ukraine joining NATO would be the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin.
OK, you've given us much to think about there, and we thank you for that. Stephen Wertheim from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.